Here we are once again, everyone, talking Star Trek Lower Decks all the way up to the 6th episode of the 3rd season entitled Hear All, Trust Nothing. And before we get too far into this, be warned, spoilers are ahead, so if you're not interested in that sort of thing, duck out and come back after you've watched it. Otherwise, let's proceed into the episode itself. So if you've been following along, basically I've only really enjoyed 2 episodes from this season, the first episode and the very last episode before this. Well, now I have to add a 3rd episode that I pretty much thoroughly enjoyed into the mix. However, there were a couple points that I really couldn't stand. So let's go into a little bit of what happened in the story. We have our characters split off, which apparently a lot of people really enjoy. I personally would very much like one episode at least to focus on all of them actually doing something together. I understand the whole concept of having to split stories into the A plot, the B plot, the C plot. However, this is a 20-something minute episode, and we're putting A plot, B plot, C plot. We even have a D plot in this episode going on. And the story in an animated series that's a comedic base like this is already pretty thin to begin with, and that just leads to a lot of superfluous stuff that doesn't really add to the plot and is just there for slapstick humor's sake. And I understand that's the point of cartoons a lot of the time, but I just like a story that actually kind of coheres to itself a little bit better on occasion. I'm not saying they have to do that every single time. It just, to me, would be something that might feel a little bit more like a real Star Trek, and I know people are going to hate that, if they were to do that. So our story starts out, the Cerritos is going to Deep Space Nine. Obviously, we knew that was happening this season. This is that episode, although I have personal thoughts that we're going to be back to Deep Space Nine later, but that remains to be seen. So our crew is going to deliver some stuff as Deep Space Nine is going to be the hub of a renewed negotiation between one of the members of the Dominion and the Federation. Now, this is the member of the Dominion we have actually met before, way back in Deep Space Nine, before we even really knew about the Jem'Hadar, the Founders, the Vorta, all that stuff. This is one of the first inklings of the Dominion that we had. Quark actually had some experience with them, and I believe this was actually the species where James Cromwell played a character, which is interesting they didn't have him come back, as he already appeared in this season voicing Zephram Cochrane. I feel like that was kind of a missed opportunity to kind of bring that character back, since we already had the actor appearing in this season. He could have done some voice work for that, probably at the same time, but I digress. So here is the beautiful shot. We saw a lot of that spoiled in the trailer, but it is rendered fantastically. That's one thing I do like to give this show credit for. Not always a fan of the character animation, but the background Star Trek, Starfleet stuff, the ships, the stations, the technology, always looks just superb. And they did not spare anything with the Deep Space Nine here. In fact, it looks almost more realistic than anything else in the show, which isn't really a negative thing, but it looks like they spent so much more time actually making Deep Space Nine look real that some of the more 2D animated stuff next to it kind of has a little discrepancy, but I'm not going to say anything negative because it does look beautiful and it's nice to see that again. Our characters are splitting up, as I already mentioned. Mariner's going to have this side plot, so this is, I guess, going to be the first time that she meets the friends of Jennifer. This is a storyline, didn't really tie much into the plot, and honestly, it's good for character work for Mariner, but if you excise this from the episode entirely, it probably would actually have the Deep Space Nine aspects feel a little better, because they didn't even go to Deep Space Nine. It had nothing to do with that, and it felt just a little bit like it could have appeared in any episode. It had no tie-in whatsoever. Now here we have our first returning character, Kira, obviously voiced by the original actress Nana Visitor, which is fantastic. One thing I will say about this, when we meet our second returning character in a moment, it's something did stand out to me as a little odd. She obviously knows Shax from the Resistance days. That was cool, tying them in together. I don't know how realistic that would be, but in my theory, this isn't actually taking place in the Star Trek universe proper, so that doesn't really mean anything anyways. And then we've got the ship docking with Deep Space Nine here to start negotiations. Quark is the second returning character from Deep Space Nine. Now, I mentioned I was going to say something that stood out to me a little bit. He's also voiced by Armin Shimmerman. Fantastic for him to return. Now, both of them played their characters well. However, the voice acting on both of them, in certain instances, seemed a little bit out of character and a little more whimsical, cartoonish. And I also mentioned briefly I had a theory on this. I've made a whole video on that, so check that out if you're interested. I personally believe that Lower Decks is a television program within the Star Trek universe, so Quark and Kira are actually their real-world Star Trek counterparts, I guess you could say, doing the voice acting for this show, which leads more credence to the fact that they may act a little bit out of character because they're playing up themselves. They're being a goofier, more played-up version of the real-world version that we knew from Deep Space Nine itself. So that doesn't really bug me too much that they seemed a little bit they took their character and amped it up just a little bit. There is a little bit of extra emphasis on some of the words they said, a little bit more high-pitched screaminess to some of the acting, which would make sense if you're trying to play yourself, but you dial that up to 11. So what happens here is the negotiations are going on Deep Space Nine. Quark has franchised his bar all over the quadrant and probably beyond the quadrant, actually. We've actually seen that in a couple other shows earlier, Lower Decks, and Picard of all places on Free Cloud. And he's got this fantastic Quarks Bar 2000 replicator, which I guess is able to make drinks far superior than anything that has Federation standard technology. He claims he invented this. All the recipes are some fantastic thing he's developed over years and years of bartending. That's the crux of what's going on. That will actually play into the main storyline. And then we've got Rutherford and Tandy starting their main storyline, which is delivering the supplies to the alien ship. And they go to visit the bar. Good to see Morn here. Obviously, he doesn't have a speaking role because he never did in the original Deep Space Nine. However, I do think it would be fantastic if they brought in the original actor to sit in the sound booth and not do anything. I know that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but just the fact that they would do something like that, to me, is actually funny. I don't know if they actually would have done something like that, but I would have loved to see the behind-the-scenes photos of that. That would have been something fun to have on the after show or something like that. The second down part of this episode, to me, is the Tendy and Rutherford storyline. This one, however, actually does tie into the main overall story, but this character they introduce here, another Orion in Starfleet who is super into Tendy because, hey, I don't see many Orions. He was exceptionally grating, and I understand he was supposed to be that type of character, but this entire storyline was just too much for me. It was great character growth for Tendy, great to find out some confirmed information we've thought about her for a while, but the storyline and the acting of this guy was just too much for me. I guess that's more to taste, but I mean, it was just grating. So we take the Mariner scenes, we take the Tendy scenes, and basically excise most of them from the episode, and I think this could have been the perfect episode of Lower Decks. So we go back to the Mariner storyline here. She's meeting the friends. It's a very unfun situation for Mariner. They're going to sit around and do personal expression dances, read some poetry, talk about their feelings, make some candles. Nothing that Mariner seems like is interesting to her. And we find out a little later on that Jennifer actually wanted Mariner to come over and be herself. So Mariner is trying to hide her true self and enjoy this group of friends and try to fit in, where Jennifer actually didn't want that. She wanted Mariner to come over, exert her actual self, and stand up for herself. Whatever. This could have taken place anywhere in the timeline, any other episode. It's just character work. It didn't really relate to the overall storyline. So here's the meeting. Gets off to a slow start because the original crew and ship that was going to do the negotiations had to bow out because they were dealing with some other disaster. Whatever. They bring in gifts, so the aliens don't actually care. Then we move on to the main crux of the problem, which turns out that, dun dun dun, Quark's replicator was using stolen technology from these aliens. So these aliens are called the Karema. I think I failed to mention that earlier in my review, but whatever. And they were returning from Deep Space Nine. So the technology, in my opinion, may have been stolen from that very episode where they appeared in Deep Space Nine. However, that wasn't really specified. So I guess it could have been some other meeting that happened afterwards, but I like to think that it actually is a result of the episode in Deep Space Nine. That to me actually adds a little bit more flavor to this. So then we find out that this Mesk guy was acting the whole time. He wasn't actually ever an Orion pirate. Haha, played for jokes. But then we find out that actually Tendy grew up in the Syndicate. Her parents were giant Orion pirates. She's been trying to hide that. Obviously, we've had some indications of that earlier in the show. So she has to take over to solve the situation. Oh, I completely forgot to mention. After the Karema found out that Quark stole their technology, they used some magic technology to shut down all of the power on both Deep Space Nine and the Cerritos. Their ship was not affected. Tendy, Rutherford, and Mesk were on their ship delivering the supplies. They got trapped. Tendy uses her pirate skills and some super fancy Orion multi-tool to escape, and that's her storyline. She saves the day. She's actually able to shut down the ship before they escape through the wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant. That's her storyline. Actually ties in everything up to that point with the Mesk stuff. Didn't need that. Didn't care for that. Seeing Tendy save the day using her skills, that part I actually did enjoy. We get a little more story to her. We get a little action for her. That part I enjoyed. Everything prior to that, meh, in my opinion. The Mariner storyline, I do digress a little bit here because it did have a slight bearing on the other story. Because the power to the Cerritos was shut off, they started losing oxygen because of the candles they made. So she decides you don't use as much oxygen when you're unconscious. So she stuns every single person in the party, including herself and Jennifer. End of that storyline. So I guess it did have a slight tie-in, but again, it wasn't needed for this episode whatsoever. Here we have Tendy using the multi-tool to escape. Here they are shutting down the ship. I already talked about that. So we end up rescuing Quark. Turns out they weren't kidnapping him as our crew originally thought. They were arresting him for his crimes. And here they come up with a compromise. Because Quark stole and used their technology to create his business, they're going to get 76% of all Quark's franchise profits, and Tendy decides she's going to embrace her heritage. That seems to be the two takeaways. Oh, I completely forgot to mention the fourth storyline that's occurring at the same time. Boimler is apparently a fantastic Dabo player, and he wins all sorts of huge, whopping piles of Latinum, and then he decides, you know what? We don't use money in the Federation. I'll trade it all for Quark's gift certificate, and he gets a whole bunch of stuff from the gift shop. I didn't mention that because it was just a funny aside that had absolutely no bearing again on the episode, which is fine because his didn't take up all that much time. However, if you excise most of the Tendy Mesk stuff, you excise most of the Mariner relationship stuff, you pad out the visit to Deep Space Nine a little bit more, and in my opinion, you get a perfect episode, whereas right now, those two parts dragged it down. And again, that's just for me. I've seen a hell of a lot of people talking about how fun the Orion stuff was with Mesk. So I guess I just don't enjoy that type of cartoony archetype in shows like this. That's a personal taste issue, so I'm not going to yell at you if you didn't care about that. But for me, I wish this show would skew a bit more Star Trek than the zany cartoon hijinks that it includes sometimes. It was still a fantastic episode, and I really did enjoy seeing the returning characters, and especially all the Deep Space Nine love they shoved in there, especially having things just innocuously in the background like Morn. They mentioned a tailor shop, and I like the fact that they didn't shoehorn in characters that canonically shouldn't be there at the time. They didn't have Cisco there, they didn't have Odo there, they didn't have Chief O'Brien there, even though they did reference Mirror Chief O'Brien as Smiley, and it was just a fun experience overall. If you take out my minor nitpicks, I think you would really enjoy this episode if you're a fan of Lower Decks in general, and especially Deep Space Nine. If you don't think too hard about it, and you don't think too hard about the implications to the universe overall, it's just a fun ride. So until next time, what did you think about this episode? Let me know your thoughts below. Like, share, subscribe, do all that fancy stuff. And until next time, computer and program.